Hey folks, before the video starts, I want to say big thank you for the feedback you gave me in the last video. Again, I will be short and say, as every other video, to leave a like and hit the subscribe button. Also, don't forget to comment down below, helping me to give proof to YouTube that all of you who follow this channel so far are real people who watch my videos. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy. A dark web hitman known as the Sculptor is back after 10 years. His latest target looks exactly like me. Alright, so this is going to sound insane, but bear with me. I don't really post on Reddit much, but I've been up for the past 2 nights trying to make sense of what I found, and honestly, I don't know where else to turn. I swear this is real, and if it's not, then I'm caught up in the most elaborate prank of all time. Let me back up. My name's Jake, and I'm just a regular guy. I work in IT, mostly freelance stuff, fixing people's computers or setting up networks for small businesses. Nothing glamorous, but it pays the bills. I live alone in a 1-bedroom apartment in a pretty boring town. My biggest thrill most days is grabbing a coffee and scrolling Reddit. Last Friday night, though, I did something stupid. See, I've always been fascinated by the deep web. Not the regular internet you use every day, but the hidden corners, the place people whisper about, where you can supposedly find anything if you know where to look. Most of it is just junk, forums, old forgotten websites, or marketplaces that sell knockoff handbags. But I'd heard stories about the other stuff, the weird, unsettling things. I guess part of me wanted to see if any of it was real. So I downloaded Tor, set up a VPN, and started browsing. At first, it was just as underwhelming as I'd heard. Busted marketplaces, broken links, sketchy forums. I almost gave up, but then I stumbled across a post in a forum called The Sculptor's Return. It was cryptic, just a few lines of text, written like some creepy poem or something. Chisel the flesh, mold the bone. 10 years have passed, and he's not alone. The sculptor works by blade and key. Watch your back, or next it's thee. I rolled my eyes. It sounded like some bad attempt at horror. But then I noticed the replies. Hundreds of them. People freaking out, saying things like, he's back, and this is a bad joke, right? Right? Others posted screenshots of what looked like an auction page, a place where you could place bids to, hire someone to take care of people. You get what I mean. But here's the kicker. The targets weren't just random names. There were photos, detailed profiles. Some even had home addresses. I should have closed the page right then, but curiosity got the better of me. I kept digging, clicking through thread after thread, until I found what they were talking about. It was a plain black site with the words, The Sculptor's Workshop, at the top. No fancy graphics, no creepy music, just a simple list of projects. Each project had a photo, a code name, and the current bid. Most of the code names were things like the opportunist or the betrayer. Creepy, but vague enough to dismiss as fake. And then I saw it. There, near the bottom of the page, was a listing called The Imposter. The photo was me, or someone who looked exactly like me. Same messy brown hair, same scruffy beard, even the same stupid hoodie I was wearing that day. My stomach dropped. I stared at the screen for what felt like an hour, my mind racing. This had to be a prank, right? Someone photoshopped my face and put it here as a joke. But who? And why? I don't have enemies. I'm not important enough for something like this. The worst part, my details were there too. My name, my age, and the city I live in. No exact address, but close enough to make my skin crawl. The current bid was $5,000. Now, I know what you're thinking. Jake, close the laptop and call the cops. Trust me, I wanted to. But I'd heard enough about the deep web to know that going to the police doesn't always help. For one, they might not even believe me. And even if they did, what could they do? Track down a hitman who's been a ghost for a decade? Yeah, good luck with that. Instead, I did the one thing you should never do. I refreshed the page. The bid had gone up. $7,500. I slammed my laptop shut and sat there in the dark, trying not to throw up. This was real. Somehow, some way, this was happening to me. But why? I'm nobody. Just a guy who fixes Wi-Fi routers for a living. Then it hit me. The name. The imposter. What if this wasn't a mistake? What if someone thought I was pretending to be them? Or worse, what if I actually looked like someone else? Someone who had done something terrible. That night, I barely slept. Every creak in my apartment, every passing car, made my heart race. I kept my laptop on my nightstand, refreshing the page every hour. The bids just kept climbing. $10,000, $12,000, $15,000. By morning, it was at $20,000. And then the listing disappeared. Just gone. No explanation, no updates, nothing. Part of me wanted to believe it was over, that whoever put my photo up had changed their mind. But another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. That was 3 days ago. Since then, I've noticed things. Small things, like my apartment feeling slightly colder when I come home, or my toothbrush being in the wrong spot. Yesterday, I swore I saw someone standing across the street, just staring at my building. When I went to check, they were gone. And tonight, I found something taped to my front door. It was a piece of paper, folded neatly in half. On the outside, in black marker, were 2 words: The Sculptor. Inside, there was a single sentence: You can't outrun art. I stood there in the hallway, staring at that note like it might explode. My fingers shook as I held it, the words burning into my brain. You can't outrun art. It wasn't just a threat. It felt personal, like someone had been watching me, waiting for the right moment to let me know they were there. My first instinct was to grab my phone and call someone, anyone. But who was I supposed to call? The cops? What was I going to tell them? Hey, there's this hitman from the dark web who's targeting me because I look like someone else. Yeah, no thanks. I'm not looking to get locked in a psych ward. Instead, I locked every door and window in my apartment, turned off all the lights, and sat in the dark with a kitchen knife in my lap. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every shadow on the wall, every sound from outside felt like a warning, but nothing happened. The next morning, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I figured if I was going to have any chance of getting out of this, I needed to know who or what I was dealing with. So I went back to the deep web. I know what you're thinking. Seriously? You just got targeted on the deep web, and you went back? Trust me, I hated the idea too. But the way I saw it, I didn't have a choice. Whoever this sculptor was, they clearly weren't going to stop just because I locked my doors. If anything, they'd already proven they could get to me anytime they wanted. I needed to figure out why I was on their radar, and, more importantly, how to get off it. It took me hours to find the forum again. The original thread about the sculptor had been deleted, and most of the posts mentioning him were either vague or full of panicked speculation. But eventually, I found a small group of people talking about him in a hidden thread. They called themselves the Survivors. I don't know if survivors is the right word though. A lot of the posts were from people who said they'd lost friends or family members to the sculptor. Others claimed they'd been targeted themselves and somehow made it out alive. They shared details about what he does, how he works, and how to recognize when you're being followed. It wasn't comforting. According to them, the sculptor isn't just a hitman. He's an artist, or at least that's how he sees himself. His work is famous, or infamous, I guess, for being theatrical. He doesn't just kill people, he makes a statement out of it. Some of the survivors shared photos, blurry screenshots, and grainy images that were probably taken before the authorities pulled them off the internet. One photo showed a body posed in a chair, its head replaced with what looked like a sculpted mask of the person's own face. Another showed someone hung like a marionette, with strings connected to their fingers and feet. The worst part, each piece was labeled with a code name, just like the listings on the site. The liar, the betrayer, the thief. I couldn't breathe. All I could think about was the listing I'd seen, the imposter. Was that going to be me? A macabre statue, or some twisted work of art for the dark web to gawk at? One post caught my attention. It was from someone claiming they'd been targeted years ago, but managed to escape. They said the sculptor doesn't work alone. He has assistants, people who scout out his targets, gather information, and prepare the canvas. That's what he calls his victims, canvases. The assistants are the ones who break into your home, leave notes, move things around, just enough to mess with your head before the real work begins. The guy who wrote the post said he started noticing the same car parked near his house every night, and a few times he swore he saw someone following him on foot. That's when he decided to disappear. He packed up everything he owned and moved across the country without telling anyone. He said it worked, for him at least. But even years later, he still sleeps with a gun under his pillow. Reading that post made my skin crawl. The toothbrush, the cold apartment, the figure outside my building. It wasn't just paranoia. Someone really had been here. Someone was watching me, preparing me. I spent the rest of the day trying to figure out my next move. I thought about packing a bag and leaving town, like the guy in the forum. But where would I go? My parents live in another state, but dragging them into this mess felt like a death sentence. I don't have many close friends, and even if I did, how do you explain something like this without sounding insane? That night, I decided to set up some cameras. Nothing fancy, just a couple of old webcams I had lying around from work. I pointed one at my front door and another at the window in my living room. Then, I sat down with my laptop and tried to distract myself with a video game. It didn't work. Every few minutes, I'd glance at the live feed from the cameras, half expecting to see someone staring back at me. Around 2 a.m., I finally started to doze off. That's when the notification popped up. My webcam software has a motion detection feature. It pings your phone or computer if it picks up anything moving. At first, I thought it was a bug, or maybe a shadow from outside. But when I opened the app, my stomach dropped. There was someone standing in my hallway. They weren't moving, just standing there, perfectly still, like they were waiting for me to notice them. Their face was covered by something. I couldn't tell if it was a mask or a hood, but it made them look almost featureless, like a blank mannequin. I froze. I didn't breathe, didn't blink. My brain was screaming at me to do something, but my body wouldn't listen. All I could do was stare at the screen, watching this person stand in the hallway outside my bedroom. And then they turned. Slowly, deliberately, they turned to face the camera. They tilted their head as if they knew I was watching. And then they did something I'll never forget. They waved. Not a big dramatic wave, just a small casual gesture, like they were saying hello, like we were old friends. I don't remember grabbing the knife, but suddenly it was in my hand. I bolted to the hallway, ready to fight, ready to do something. But when I got there, it was empty. No one was there. The front door was locked, the windows were shut, and there was no sign anyone had been inside. But when I checked the camera feed again, the figure was gone. The only thing they left behind was a single word, scrawled on the wall in what looked like black ink. Soon. When I saw that word, soon, written on my wall, something inside me snapped. I wasn't scared anymore. I was angry. I'd been sitting here, letting this thing, this person or group of people, or whatever the hell they were, turn my life into a nightmare. But now they were in my home, my safe space, playing with me like I was some helpless mouse. I wanted to fight back. Problem was, I had no idea how. The first thing I did was scrub the word off the wall. It came off easier than I expected. Cheap ink, or maybe even marker. But as I was cleaning, I noticed something strange. My hallway light had been flickering earlier that day, and I'd assumed the bulb was dying. But when I looked closer, I realized the fixture had been tampered with. The screws were loose, like someone had taken it apart and put it back together in a hurry. I pulled the fixture down, and sure enough, there was a tiny black device wedged into the wiring. A camera. It wasn't one of mine. This was something else. Professional looking, compact, with a little red light that blinked every few seconds. My stomach churned as I stared at it, wondering how long it had been there, and if there were more. I tore my apartment apart after that. I checked every light fixture, every vent, every crevice I could think of, and I found them. 3 more cameras, all hidden in places I never would have thought to look. One in the corner of my bedroom, one under the kitchen counter, and one behind a picture frame in the living room. Someone had been watching me. For how long? Days? Weeks? I had no idea. I ripped out the cameras and smashed them with a hammer, but it didn't make me feel any better. If they'd been able to get those in, they could do it again. I could replace every screw and install every deadbolt on the planet, and it wouldn't matter. They could still get in. I was out of my depth, and I knew it. So I did the one thing I never thought I'd do. I called a friend. His name's Max. We've known each other since college, back when we used to share a dorm and stay up all night playing video games. Max is one of those guys who always seems to know someone who knows someone. He's gotten me out of a few tight spots over the years, usually involving unpaid parking tickets or shady Craigslist deals. If anyone could help me figure this out, it was him. I called him around 3 a.m., and to my surprise, he actually picked up. "Dude," he said, his voice groggy, "you better be dying." "I might be," I said. "Listen, I need your help. It's serious." That woke him up. "What's going on?" I hesitated, trying to figure out how to explain this without sounding completely insane. In the end, I just told him everything. The deep web, the sculptor, the cameras, the note, the figure in my hallway. By the time I finished, Max was dead silent. "Max," I said, thinking he'd hung up. "Yeah, I'm here," he said, his voice low. "You're not messing with me, right?" "I wish I was," he sighed. "All right, first things first. Pack a bag and get the hell out of there. Go to a hotel, a friend's place, anywhere but your apartment. You can't stay there." "That's the problem," I said. "If they're tracking me, it doesn't matter where I go. They'll just follow me." "Then you need to track them," he said. "Turn the game around. Make them think you're the one in control." "How?" I asked. "Give me a few hours," he said. "I'll call you back." I didn't have much of a choice, so I sat tight and waited. In the meantime, I started going through the cameras I'd smashed, hoping to find something useful. Most of them were too damaged to work, but one was still partially intact. I hooked it up to my laptop and managed to pull a few files off the memory card. What I saw made my blood run cold. The first file was a video of me, sitting on the couch, watching TV. It was from 2 days ago. The second file showed me sleeping in bed, tossing and turning under the covers. But the third file, that's the one that got me. It wasn't a recording of me. It was of the person who'd been in my hallway. The same figure I'd seen on my webcam feed, standing motionless, staring at the camera. Only this time, they were closer. I could see the mask more clearly now. A smooth, white face, with hollow eyes and a permanent, eerie smile. They tilted their heads slightly, like they were studying the camera, and then they leaned forward and whispered something. I couldn't hear it. The audio was too faint, too garbled, but they repeated it over and over, like a mantra. I cranked the volume up as high as it would go and pressed my ear to the speaker. Finally, I caught it. "You're perfect." My heart was racing by the time Max called back. He'd done some digging and found out more about the Sculptor. Apparently, there's a pattern to the way he operates. His projects aren't random. He picks people for specific reasons that usually only make sense to him. Sometimes it's about revenge. Sometimes it's about symbolism, but it's always personal. "Any idea why he'd pick you?" Max asked. I shook my head, even though he couldn't see me. "No clue. I'm just a guy, Max. I don't have enemies. I don't even have exes that hate me." "Well, maybe it's not about you," he said. "Maybe it's about someone who looks like you, or something you've done that you don't even realize. Either way, you've got to figure it out." "And if I can't?" I asked. "Then you're gonna have to disappear," he said. "Completely." The thought made me sick to my stomach. I couldn't just vanish. I had a job, a life. My parents would think I was dead, but what choice did I have? Max said he'd keep looking for information and told me to stay put for the time being. "And Jake," he added, "whatever you do, don't engage with them. That's what they want. They want you to play their game." Too late for that, I thought. After we hung up, I went back to the video, watching it over and over again, trying to make sense of it. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. In the background, behind the figure in the hallway, there was something on the wall. It was faint, almost impossible to see, but when I zoomed in, I realized what it was. A map of my city, with a red X marked over a specific location. I didn't know what I'd find there, but I knew I had to go. If this was part of their game, then fine. I'd play, but I wasn't going to be their pawn. By the time I left my apartment, the sun was starting to rise. I had the map burned into my memory and a knife tucked into my pocket. The streets were empty, the world eerily quiet. I followed the route until I reached the location marked by the red X. It was an old warehouse, abandoned and covered in graffiti. The windows were boarded up, and the front door hung slightly ajar. As I stepped inside, the smell hit me first, metallic and musty, like rust and damp concrete. The air was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. And then I saw it. In the center of the room, under a single dangling light bulb, was a sculpture of me. It wasn't perfect, more like an unsettling approximation. The face was carved out of wood, the body made of wire and scraps of fabric, but it was unmistakably me. My features, my posture, even the clothes I'd been wearing the day I found that note on my door. Pinned to its chest was another piece of paper with 2 words written in neat black ink. Your turn. The warehouse was silent, except for the faint hum of the flickering light bulb overhead. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. That thing, the sculpture, it was me. Not a vague resemblance, but an uncanny, grotesque imitation. The more I looked at it, the worse it got. The face was too smooth, the eyes too wide, the mouth stretched into a warped version of my own awkward smile. It was as if someone had studied me with surgical precision and then twisted me into something barely human. I forced myself to move closer, every instinct screaming at me to run. The air around the sculpture felt heavier, colder, like stepping into a freezer. My eyes locked onto the piece of paper pinned to its chest. Your turn. What the hell does that mean? I whispered, my voice echoing in the empty space. I reached out, my hand trembling, and yanked the paper free. It was thicker than I expected, like high-quality cardstock. As I turned it over, I realized it wasn't just a note. It was a photograph. My blood went ice cold. The photo was of me, standing in my own living room. It wasn't one of the images from the cameras I'd destroyed. This one was recent. I could tell by the clothes I was wearing, by the cup of coffee on the table that I'd forgotten to finish that morning. The angle was high, almost bird's eye, like it had been taken from the ceiling. They'd been in my apartment again, and I hadn't even noticed. I stumbled back, the photo slipping from my fingers. That's when I saw it. A table pushed against the far wall, covered in tools. Not regular tools. These were customized. A hammer with the claw reshaped into something jagged and serrated. A chisel with the handle wrapped in leather, the blade gleaming unnaturally sharp. Next to them was a roll of plastic sheeting, a spool of wire, and a bag of what looked like nails. But they weren't ordinary nails. They were long, thin, and rusted, like they'd been pulled from an old coffin. This wasn't just some warehouse. This was a workshop, his workshop, and I was standing in it. I felt sick. My head spun, and for a second, I thought I might pass out. I backed away from the tools, my footsteps echoing on the concrete floor, and that's when I noticed the other sculptures. They were lined up against the walls, half hidden in the shadows. Dozens of them, maybe more. Each one was different, but they all had the same eerie quality. Faces too smooth, eyes too wide, mouths frozen in unnatural expressions. Some were made of wood and wire like mine, while others were crafted from what looked like plaster, cloth, or even metal. One of them had hair, real hair. I turned away, bile rising in my throat, and tried to steady my breathing. I needed to get out of there. I needed to leave before whoever made these things came back. But as I turned toward the door, I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere deeper in the warehouse. My chest tightened as I strained to listen, every nerve in my body on high alert. The footsteps weren't coming toward me. They were circling, like whoever was there was taking their time, enjoying the game. I glanced around for a weapon and grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a metal pipe leaning against the wall. It was heavy and rusted, but it felt solid in my hand. I gripped it tightly, my palms slick with sweat, and pressed my back against the cold concrete wall. The footsteps stopped. The silence was worse. My ears strained for any sound, any hint of movement, but there was nothing. Just the faint buzz of the light bulb above me, flickering like it might go out at any second. Then, a voice. Software, calm, almost gentle. "I see you found my work." It came from somewhere behind me. I spun around, raising the pipe, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to echo, bouncing off the walls, making it impossible to pinpoint its source. "You're even better in person," the voice continued. "I wasn't sure at first. The photos don't always capture the essence. But you're perfect." My stomach churned. It was the same phrase I'd heard on the video. "You're perfect." "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Why are you doing this?" There was a long pause, and then the voice chuckled. It wasn't a normal laugh. It was low and throaty, like the sound a predator makes before it pounces. "Why do artists create?" the voice said. "To capture beauty, to tell a story, to leave a legacy." "This isn't art," I yelled, gripping the pipe so hard my knuckles turned white. "This is sick." "Art isn't always pretty," the voice replied. "Sometimes it's meant to unsettle, to provoke, to transcend." I couldn't take it anymore. I charged toward the sound of the voice, swinging the pipe wildly, hoping to hit something, anything. But all I hit was empty air. The warehouse was too big, too dark, and the voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then I felt it. A hand, cold and strong, gripping my shoulder. I whipped around, swinging the pipe, but whoever, or whatever, had been there was gone. The grip left a faint, icy ache in my shoulder, like the hand had lingered longer than it should have. I stumbled backward, my breathing ragged, and that's when I saw it. The sculpture of me was no longer in the center of the room. It was right in front of me. I don't know how it moved. I didn't hear it, didn't see it, but there it was, standing inches away, its hollow eyes staring into mine. The smile on its face seemed wider now, more menacing, like it was mocking me. And then it spoke, not with a voice, but with a small mechanical whir. Its mouth opened slowly, jerking unnaturally, and a distorted recording of my own voice came out. "Your turn." I don't remember how I got out of there. 1 minute, I was standing face to face with that thing, and the next, I was sprinting down the street, the cold morning air burning my lungs. I didn't stop running until I reached a gas station 2 miles away. The clerk gave me a strange look as I stumbled inside, gasping for air, my clothes soaked in sweat. I locked myself in the bathroom and called Max. He answered on the second ring. "Jake?" he said. "What's going on?" "I found it," I said, my voice shaking. "The Sculptor's workshop. I found it." There was a long pause. "You need to get out of there," Max said. "Now." "I already did," I said. "But he was there, Max. He was there." Max cursed under his breath. "All right, listen to me. You need to disappear. For real this time. I don't care where you go, but you can't stay in that town. I'll help you set up a burner phone, a fake ID, whatever you need. But you have to leave. Tonight." I wanted to argue, to tell him there had to be another way. But deep down, I knew he was right. This wasn't going to stop. Not unless I stopped it first. As I left the gas station, I felt something in my pocket. I reached in and pulled out the piece of paper I'd taken from the sculpture, the one that said, "Your turn." But the words were gone. In their place was a single line of text written in a shaky, almost childlike scroll. The masterpiece is almost complete. By the time I got back to my apartment, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the street. The place felt different, like it was holding its breath, waiting for me. I didn't even bother checking the locks this time. What was the point? They'd been in and out so many times. They probably had their own key. I threw my bag on the couch, my brain running in a million different directions. I knew I couldn't stay, but I needed time to think, to plan my next move. Max had promised to help me disappear, but what did that even mean? A new name? A new life? Did I just vanish and hope the sculptor didn't find me again? I didn't have long to think. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Faint at first, like burning plastic, but it grew stronger as I walked deeper into the apartment. It was coming from the kitchen. My stomach twisted as I pushed the door open, half expecting to find something, someone waiting for me. Instead, I found my laptop sitting on the counter, its screen cracked and warped from heat. The keyboard was melted, and the faint smell of burnt electronics filled the air. Next to it was a note, written in the same black ink as before. No more distractions. Focus on the art. I stared at the words, my pulse racing. They weren't just watching me anymore. They were controlling me. Every move I made, every attempt to fight back, they were one step ahead. It wasn't a game to them. It was a performance, and I was the star. I grabbed my phone to call Max, but the screen stayed black, dead. I checked the charger and the outlets, but nothing worked. They'd cut me off, isolated me. I was alone. That's when I noticed something new. In the center of the living room, right where my coffee table used to be, was a box. Plain, unmarked, just sitting there like it had been waiting for me. My hands trembled as I approached it, every instinct screaming at me to leave, to run. But I couldn't. Not until I knew. I knelt down and lifted the lid. Inside was a mask. My mask. It was made of some kind of pale ceramic, smooth and cold to the touch. The features were exaggerated, my nose too sharp, my smile stretched unnaturally wide. But it was unmistakably me. Beneath the mask was a folded piece of paper. "Put it on." I dropped the mask and stumbled back, my chest tightening. I could feel the walls closing in, the air growing thicker. This wasn't just psychological anymore. They wanted me to participate, to become part of their art. A sudden knock at the door snapped me out of my thoughts. 3 knocks, slow, deliberate. I froze, my eyes darting to the door. Whoever it was didn't knock again. They were waiting. I crept towards the peephole, holding my breath as I pressed my eye to the glass. The hallway was empty. I backed away, my heart pounding, and that's when I heard it. A faint scratching sound, like nails on wood. It was coming from inside the apartment, from the bedroom. I grabbed the metal pipe I'd brought back from the warehouse, my palm slick with sweat. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't. Not without knowing, not without facing it. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it impenetrable. The scratching grew louder as I approached, my footsteps barely making a sound on the carpet. I raised the pipe, ready to swing, and pushed the door open. The room was empty. At least, it looked empty. But then I saw it. The closet door was open just a crack. the faintest sliver of light spilling out. The scratching was louder now, rhythmic, almost purposeful. I stepped forward, every muscle in my body coiled like a spring. My hand trembled as I reached for the closet door. I counted to 3 in my head, and then I yanked it open. Nothing, just clothes, hangers, and a pile of old shoes. The scratching had stopped. I let out a shaky breath, lowering the pipe, and that's when I felt it. Breath, hot, shallow breath, on the back of my neck. I spun around, swinging the pipe, but it hit nothing but air. The room was empty, yet the sensation lingered, crawling under my skin. I backed out of the bedroom, my head spinning, and nearly tripped over something in the hallway. It was the mask. Only now, it wasn't in the box. It was on the floor, staring up at me with those hollow, exaggerated features. And next to it, scrawled on the carpet in black ink, was a single word: run. I didn't think. I just ran. Out of the apartment, down the stairs, and into the freezing night air. I didn't stop until I was halfway across town, my lungs burning, my legs threatening to give out. I ducked into a 24-hour diner, collapsing into a booth near the back. The waitress gave me a concerned look, but didn't say anything as I ordered coffee. I sat there for hours, watching the door, waiting for someone to come for me. But nothing happened. The city moved on around me, oblivious to the nightmare I was living. Eventually, Max called. I don't know how he found me, but his voice was a lifeline. "You okay?" he asked. "No," I said. "I don't think I'll ever be okay again." "Listen," he said, his voice steady. "I found something about the sculptor. There's a pattern. All his victims, they disappear for a few days before they're found. That's when he finishes the masterpiece. He doesn't just kill them, Jake. He transforms them." "What does that mean?" I whispered. "It means you don't have much time," he said. "We need to get you out. Tonight." But I never got the chance. As I hung up, I noticed something on the window next to me. At first, I thought it was a smudge, but when I leaned closer, I realized it was writing. 3 words, written in black ink. "You're already finished." I bolted out of the diner, my heart racing, but the streets were empty. No one followed me. No one stopped me. I ran until I reached a nearby motel, paid cash for a room, and locked myself inside. That was 2 days ago. Since then, I've been hiding, waiting for something to happen. Every time I close my eyes, I see that mask, that sculpture. I hear the voice whispering, "You're perfect." This morning, I woke up to find something on the nightstand. A photo. It's of me. Only it's not me. It's the sculpture, and it's smiling wider now. My neighbor was arrested for murder 5 years ago. A dark web video shows him escaping from prison and heading straight to my street. Alright, so I live in a quiet little neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but nice enough. It's the kind of place where you nod politely at your neighbors, but you don't really know them, if that makes sense. I've lived here for about 8 years, and up until 5 years ago, nothing strange ever happened here. It was just normal, peaceful, boring, even. Then my neighbor, Mr. Grayson, got arrested. Mr. Grayson was the kind of guy you wouldn't notice unless you really paid attention. He lived alone in this old house across the street, mid-40s, kind of scruffy, and always wearing the same beat-up Red Sox cap. He wasn't the wave at you from the porch type. Actually, he didn't talk to anyone, really. He'd nod sometimes if we crossed paths, but that was it. So, you can imagine the shock when the cop showed up at his house one night. SWAT team and everything. I remember watching from my window as they dragged him out in handcuffs. He was barefoot, wearing a stained white t-shirt and boxers, and he looked blank, like he wasn't even there. The news said he'd murdered someone, but they didn't give any details, just that it was brutal. That word stuck with me. Brutal. I tried not to think about it too much after that. Life went on. His house stayed empty for a while, before the bank eventually took it over and sold it to some family I barely see. But every now and then, I'd catch myself looking at it, imagining Mr. Grayson in there, pacing around, planning whatever it was he did. Anyway, fast forward to last night. I've got this bad habit of staying up way too late scrolling Reddit or watching YouTube. You know how it goes. 1 second you're watching a video about haunted hotels, and the next you're knee-deep in some conspiracy about lizard people. Well, last night, I ended up clicking on a thread about the dark web. People were sharing stories about creepy stuff they'd stumbled across. Weird chat rooms, illegal auctions, you name it. One comment caught my eye. Someone mentioned a video called The Unseen Escape. It was supposedly floating around on some dark web forum, and they swore it was real. The description said it was security footage of a man breaking out of a maximum security prison. The twist: he wasn't breaking out alone. They didn't say much more, just that it was messed up and not for the faint of heart. I don't know why, but my curiosity got the better of me. I'm not the kind of person who messes around with the dark web. Seriously, I barely know how to clear my browser history, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to see this video. Maybe it was because it sounded so over the top. Like, come on, a real prison break? Sure. So, I did what any rational person would do at 2 a.m. I googled it. Obviously, it didn't show up on any normal sites, but I found a bunch of threads on shady forums talking about it. People were asking for links or trying to trade other videos for it, which just made it seem more like an urban legend. Still, I kept digging. Eventually, I found a site. I'm not going to name it here, because honestly, I don't want anyone else making the same mistake I did. The homepage was simple. Black background, plain white text. It felt like something out of a bad hacker movie. There was a list of videos, and sure enough, The Unseen Escape was right there near the top. Next to it was a warning. View at your own risk. You cannot unsee this. Now, let me just say, I'm not stupid. I know there's some messed up stuff out there, and I wasn't about to download anything shady. But the video was embedded, so I figured, what's the harm in watching? Famous last words, right? The video started with grainy black and white footage of a prison cell. The timestamp in the corner said it was from about 2 months ago, around 3 a.m. The cell was empty at first, but then a man walked into frame. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit, and his face was partially obscured by the shadows. He just stood there for a minute, not moving. Then he turned toward the camera. My stomach dropped. Even with the bad quality, I recognized him. It was Mr. Grayson. At this point, I was equal parts freaked out and fascinated. I mean, how could this even be possible? The dude was supposed to be locked up for life, right? But there he was, staring directly into the camera, like he knew I was watching. Then things got weirder. Grayson stepped out of the frame, and for a second I thought the video was over, but then the cell door opened. On its own. No guards, no keys, just opened. Grayson came back into view, but he wasn't alone. I couldn't make out who or what was with him. It was tall, hunched over, and its movements were unnatural, like it was glitching. 1 second, it was behind him, and the next, it was ahead of him, leading him down the hallway. The camera followed them, even though there was no one to operate it. That's when I realized something that sent a chill down my spine. The timestamp wasn't changing. The video wasn't a recording, it was live, and they were heading straight for my street. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped my laptop. I stared at the screen, hoping, praying that I was wrong. But there it was, the timestamp frozen at 3 a.m., and the unmistakable sight of my neighborhood coming into focus. It wasn't some random street or a generic setting. The camera was following Grayson, and he was heading straight toward my street. I slammed the laptop shut, like it would stop the video from playing, but the image was burned into my brain. It wasn't just the sight of my neighborhood that had me rattled. It was the thing with him, that tall, glitching shadow. My brain couldn't make sense of it. It didn't move like anything human, and yet it was somehow guiding Grayson, pulling him forward. And the way the camera moved, almost like it was hovering, tracking them without a sound. It didn't feel right. Nothing about this felt right. I took a deep breath and told myself to calm down. This had to be some kind of sick prank, right? Someone had edited the footage to make it look like my neighborhood. Maybe they used Google Maps or something. I mean, people fake stuff like this all the time for views or clout or whatever. But the knot in my stomach told me it wasn't that simple. And then I heard it. A noise outside. It was faint, like the sound of gravel crunching underfoot. I froze. It could have been anything. A stray cat, a car driving by, whatever. But in that moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. I grabbed my phone and crept to the window, keeping the lights off so I wouldn't be seen. The street was quiet. Too quiet. Normally, even at this hour, I'd hear something. A distant car engine, the hum of someone's TV through an open window. But tonight, nothing. The air felt heavy, like the whole block was holding its breath. Then I saw it. A figure, standing perfectly still, under the dim glow of a street lamp. My stomach churned as I realized it was wearing an orange jumpsuit. It was Grayson. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, staring at him. He wasn't looking at my house, at least not directly. He was facing the street, his head tilted slightly downward, like he was listening for something. His hands hung limp at his sides, and he didn't move. Not an inch. I don't know why, but I reached for my phone and opened the camera app. I guess I thought I'd snap a picture, proof that I wasn't losing my mind. But just as I raised the phone to the window, the screen went black. Not just the phone, the whole house. The power had gone out. Now, I'm not proud of what I did next, but I'll admit it. I panicked. I mean, wouldn't you? I dropped my phone, stumbled back from the window, and nearly tripped over a chair. My mind was racing. Was it just a coincidence? A random outage? Or was it because of him? I fumbled around in the dark, trying to remember where I'd left the flashlight. My hands finally found it in a kitchen drawer, and I clicked it on, the weak beam slicing through the pitch black. That's when I heard another sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the front door. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst. The tapping wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more knocks, like he was waiting for me to answer. I crept toward the door, flashlight shaking in my hand. I didn't know what I was planning to do. Look through the peephole, yell at him to leave, call the cops. My mind was a mess of half-formed thoughts and blind fear. But as I got closer, The tapping stopped. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. Just the sound of my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. And then, a whisper. Faint, almost too soft to hear, but definitely there. It came from the other side of the door. "Let me in." My blood ran cold. It wasn't Grayson's voice. It was deeper, distorted, like it was coming through a broken speaker. The kind of sound that makes your skin crawl. I backed away from the door, the flashlight trembling in my grip. "Let me in," the voice repeated, more insistent this time. And then I heard something that made me want to bolt out the back door and never come back. The sound of the lock turning. I hadn't unlocked the door. I know I hadn't. But now the knob was rattling, the deadbolt sliding free on its own. I ran to the kitchen, grabbing the first thing I could find. A butcher knife. My hands were slick with sweat, and my breathing was shallow, but I was ready to fight. Or at least, I thought I was. The door swung open, and for a split second, I thought I'd see Grayson standing there. But the porch was empty. No one was there. The street lamp outside flickered, casting long shadows across the yard. I took a shaky step forward, knife raised, and looked around. Nothing. I was about to shut the door when I noticed something on the ground. A small black USB drive. It was just sitting there, as if someone had left it for me to find. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. It was ice cold, like it had been sitting in a freezer. There was no label, no markings, just a plain black stick. I closed the door, locked it, double-locked it, and went back to the living room. My laptop was still on the coffee table. I hesitated, staring at the USB drive in my hand. Every instinct was screaming at me not to plug it in, but curiosity got the better of me. I mean, it couldn't get any worse, right? Wrong. The second I inserted the drive, the screen went blue. A series of numbers flashed across the screen, too fast to read. Then a single image appeared, a live feed of my living room. From behind me, I whipped around, but the room was empty. No one was there, but the feed didn't lie. Someone or something was watching me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The live feed on my laptop was crystal clear, an angle of my living room I couldn't place. It wasn't coming from my laptop's webcam, and it wasn't any security camera I'd ever set up. This was impossible. On the screen, I saw myself standing there, holding the knife, wide-eyed and pale. The view felt too close, too intimate. It was like someone or something was right behind me. But when I spun around, the room was still empty. My first instinct was to rip the USB drive out of the laptop, but a message suddenly appeared on the screen, typed out in stark white text against the feed. "Don't look away!" My heart was racing, every instinct screaming at me to turn the laptop off and throw it out the nearest window. But I couldn't move. It felt like the words had a weight, an authority that locked me in place. Slowly, I sank onto the couch, the knife still clenched in my hand. The live feed remained motionless for a moment, just me sitting there in the dim light of the flashlight. Then, something shifted in the frame. A flicker. At first, I thought it was just a glitch, a compression error or something. But no, it wasn't the feed. It was the shadows. One of them in the corner of the room was moving, stretching like it had come alive. It crept along the wall, slow and deliberate, until it reached the edge of the frame. Then it stopped, hovering there, as though waiting for something. I turned my head towards the corner, flashlight beam trembling. The corner was empty, just my old armchair and a stack of boxes I'd been too lazy to unpack. But in the feed, the shadow was still there, pulsing, almost breathing. And then the message on the screen changed again. Let him in. The moment I read those words, the knocking started again. This time, it wasn't just at the front door. It was at the windows, the back door, even the walls. It was coming from everywhere, a symphony of taps and thuds, like a dozen fists pounding in unison. Let him in. The words burned on the screen, demanding, relentless. My flashlight flickered, and the knocking grew louder, more erratic. It sounded like someone, or something, was about to break the doors and windows down. I yelled, "Leave me alone." My voice cracked, echoing in the silent house, but the knocking didn't stop. If anything, it got worse. My brain was spiraling. Should I run? Call the cops? Hide? None of those options felt safe. I was trapped. And then I saw it. On the live feed, the camera view shifted. It was no longer pointing at me. Instead, it was angled toward the front door. Standing there, in the dim light of the porch, was Grayson. He wasn't moving, just standing still, like a statue. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of the porch roof, but I could see enough to know it was him. And he wasn't alone. That thing, the glitching, hunched-over figure from the video, was with him, looming over his shoulder. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was something solid, something alive. Its body was impossibly thin, its arms too long, and its head didn't make sense. It seemed to shift and blur, like my eyes couldn't fully process what I was looking at. The feed zoomed in, focusing on the door handle. Slowly, it began to turn. My stomach twisted. No way that thing was getting in. I bolted to the door, pressing all my weight against it. "I'm not letting you in," I shouted, my voice shaking. The handle stopped turning. The knocking ceased. For a second, I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd stopped whatever was about to happen. But then I looked back at the laptop screen. The feed was back to showing the living room, and this time, I wasn't alone. In the corner, where the shadow had been, stood the thing. It was right there, impossibly tall, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. Its body flickered like static on an old TV, and its arms hung limply at its sides. It wasn't moving, but I could feel its presence, heavy and suffocating, like the air had been sucked out of the room. I whipped the flashlight toward the corner. Nothing. The armchair and boxes were exactly where they'd been before. But on the screen, the thing was still there, standing motionless, watching me. "Let him in," the screen demanded again. "No," I whispered, backing away from the laptop. My voice was barely audible, swallowed by the oppressive silence. The knocking started again, louder this time, more desperate. It was like the house itself was under siege. The walls seemed to shudder with every hit. I clutched the knife tighter, but it felt useless. What good was a knife against whatever this was? The laptop screen flickered, and the feed changed again. Now, it was showing my backyard. The flashlight beam in my hand trembled as I turned toward the back door. The blinds were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of someone standing just outside. It wasn't Grayson. It was taller, thinner, and the way it moved, it was like it was testing the boundaries, leaning in close to the glass, then pulling back, as if deciding whether or not to break through. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get worse, I heard something from upstairs. A slow, deliberate creak, like a footstep on the old wooden floorboards. My heart dropped into my stomach. I was alone in the house, or at least I was supposed to be. The laptop screen changed one last time. This time, the live feed was showing the hallway outside my bedroom. The door was ajar, and from the angle of the camera, I could see just enough of the darkened space beyond. Something moved in the shadows, stepping into view. It was Grayson, and he was smiling. I backed away from the screen, clutching the knife like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. My mind was screaming, "Run!" But my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted in place, trapped between the unrelenting knocks outside and the impossible presence inside. And then, with a sudden, deafening crash, the power came back on. The lights flooded the room, and everything went still. The knocking stopped. The laptop screen went blank. The feed was gone. For a moment, I thought it was over, but then I saw the USB drive. It was still plugged in. The tiny LED on its side blinked once, and then the words appeared on the screen, bold and mocking. "You can't hide forever." The silence after the chaos was worse than the noise. My house, which had felt so suffocatingly alive moments ago, now felt like a tomb. Every creak of the floorboards under my feet, every faint hum of electricity returning, sounded like it could be something or someone else. I stared at the screen, at those chilling words. "You can't hide forever." My mind was screaming at me to pull the USB drive out and smash it into 1,000 pieces, but something inside me hesitated. What if removing it triggered something worse? What if the feed came back, or Grayson, or that thing, found a new way in? My knuckles were white around the knife, and I realized my hand was cramping from gripping it so tightly. I loosened my grip just slightly, enough to flex my fingers, but I wasn't letting it go. Not yet. The words on the screen stayed there, taunting me, daring me to make the next move. I needed to think, to breathe. I needed to do something. Without unplugging the drive, I forced the laptop shut again. The screen went black, and I immediately felt the weight in the room lift. Just a little, like the tension had eased by 1/2 a degree. I backed away from the table, knife still in hand, and turned toward the stairs. Whatever had been upstairs, if it was still there, I needed to know. The flashlight in my hand barely cut through the darkness as I ascended the steps. My house wasn't big, but in that moment it felt like an endless maze. Every shadow seemed alive, twisting and stretching as I moved. The creak of each step under my weight made my stomach churn. When I reached the top of the stairs, I stopped. My bedroom door was wide open. I was sure it had been closed before. Positive. The hallway stretched out ahead of me, dimly lit by the moonlight, filtering through a small window at the end. The air felt colder up here, heavier. I forced myself to step forward, one shaky foot in front of the other. My bedroom was at the end of the hall, and with every step, the shadows inside seemed to shift, like they were waiting for me. I clenched the knife tighter. When I finally reached the door, I hesitated. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I felt like a little kid again, terrified of what might be lurking in the dark. I wanted to call out, to break the silence, but I couldn't bring myself to make a sound. Instead, I leaned in, just enough to peek inside. The room was empty. The bed was untouched. The curtain still drawn halfway across the window. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, except for one thing. My closet door was ajar. I hadn't opened it. I stepped into the room, every nerve in my body on high alert. The flashlight beam wavered as I aimed it toward the closet. My heartbeat was so loud in my ears that I thought I might pass out. The gap in the door was small, but wide enough to suggest someone or something had been in there. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own breathing. Nothing, just the faint hum of the house settling around me. I reached out with my free hand and gripped the edge of the closet door. My fingers trembled as I pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. The flashlight's beam swept across the inside of the closet. Clothes, shoes, a pile of old boxes. No one was there. But just as I was about to let out a shaky breath, I saw it. Scrawled on the inside of the closet door, and what looked like black marker, were 2 words: "Look out." The flashlight flickered, and I spun around, my back to the closet. The room was still empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. I backed toward the closet, knife held in front of me, ready to strike at the first sign of movement. And then I heard it again, the knocking. But this time, it wasn't coming from downstairs. It was coming from the window. I turned slowly, the flashlight beam jerking with every step. The curtains fluttered slightly, though the window was shut tight. And then, for the first time, I saw it up close, pressed against the glass, its face partially obscured by the curtain, was the thing. Its features were impossible to describe, shifting and distorting like I was looking at it through a broken mirror. Its eyes, or what I thought were its eyes, were 2 empty voids, endless and consuming. It raised a long skeletal hand and tapped on the glass. 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get out of the house, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The thing tilted its head, as if studying me, and then it moved its hand to the latch on the window. I had locked it earlier, I was sure of it, but the lock slid open effortlessly, as if it wasn't even there. "No," I whispered, my voice cracking. "No, no, no." The window creaked as it began to open. I turned and bolted out of the room, nearly tripping over my own feet. The flashlight clattered to the floor, but I didn't stop to pick it up. I didn't care. I just needed to get out. I sprinted down the stairs, the knife still in my hand. I was halfway to the front door when the lights flickered again, plunging the house back into darkness. The knocking resumed, this time from every direction. The walls, the ceiling, the floor. It felt like the house was alive, its walls pulsing with some malevolent force. I reached the front door and yanked it open, stepping into the cold night air. The street was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I turned to look at my house, half expecting to see Grayson or the thing standing in the doorway. But the porch was empty. I didn't stop to question it. I just ran. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to put as much distance as possible between me and that house. But as I ran, something stopped me, dead in my tracks. At the end of the street, standing under the flickering light of the last street lamp, was Grayson. He wasn't moving. He wasn't even looking at me. He was just there, his face hidden beneath the brim of that familiar Red Sox cap. And then, from somewhere behind me, I heard the distorted voice again. "You can't hide forever." I don't know how long I stood there, staring at Grayson under that flickering street lamp. Time didn't feel real anymore. My breath came in shallow gasps, and my legs felt rooted to the pavement, as if the fear itself had become a physical weight holding me in place. Grayson didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his shoulders slouched, his hands hanging limply at his sides. His head was tilted down, but I could see just enough of his face to notice something wasn't right. His skin looked too pale, almost waxy, like a mannequin that had been left out in the sun too long. But his eyes were locked onto me, even though his head barely moved. They didn't blink, didn't waver, just stared with an intensity that made my stomach churn. And then he started walking toward me. I panicked, spinning on my heel and running in the opposite direction. I didn't have a plan. I didn't even know where I was going. I just needed to get away. The cold night air burned my lungs as I sprinted down the empty street, the knife still clutched in my hand. Behind me, I could hear his footsteps, slow and deliberate, like he wasn't in any hurry, like he knew I wouldn't get far. I made it to the edge of the neighborhood, where the streetlights gave way to a stretch of woods. Normally, I wouldn't set foot in those woods at night, but my options were limited. Without thinking, I plunged into the darkness, branches scratching at my arms and face as I stumbled through the underbrush. The trees closed in around me, their twisted limbs reaching out like skeletal fingers. The footsteps followed. They were steady, unrelenting, crunching leaves and snapping twigs as they grew closer. But they weren't the only thing I heard. That distorted, inhuman voice echoed through the trees, growing louder with every step. "You can't hide forever." I wanted to scream, but I didn't dare. I clamped my free hand over my mouth, trying to muffle the sound of my own ragged breathing. I crouched behind a thick tree trunk, my back pressed against the rough bark, and listened. The footsteps stopped. The woods went silent. For a moment, all I could hear was the rapid pounding of my heart. And then, from somewhere impossibly close, the voice whispered again, "Let him in." I whipped around, the knife raised, but there was nothing there, just darkness. I was about to move when a cold hand clamped down on my shoulder. I screamed, twisting away and slashing with the knife, but I hit nothing. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root and landing hard on the ground. The flashlight I dropped earlier must have been damaged. It flickered weakly in the distance, casting long, jagged shadows that danced across the trees. And then I saw it. It was there, standing at the edge of the faint light, just beyond the reach of the beam. The thing, the shadowy, glitching figure that had been haunting the edges of my vision all night. Up close, it was worse than I could have imagined. Its limbs were impossibly long, its body stretched and warped like something out of a nightmare. Its head tilted unnaturally to the side, and its face, or what passed for a face, shifted and blurred, as if reality itself was struggling to hold it together. It didn't move toward me. It didn't have to. Its presence alone was enough to paralyze me with fear. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw Grayson step into the light. He wasn't alone. Dozens of figures followed him, their faces blank, their movements jerky and unnatural. Some of them were hunched over like they'd been broken, while others were unnervingly tall, their heads nearly brushing the tree branches. They surrounded me, forming a loose circle. Grayson stood at the front, his pale face expressionless, but his eyes burned with something primal, something wrong. The thing behind him loomed closer, its distorted form flickering like a bad signal. And then Grayson spoke. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but it carried an edge that made my skin crawl. "You let it in," he said, tilting his head slightly. "That's all it takes. A little curiosity, a little fear. And now it's here." I opened my mouth to respond, to scream, to do something, but no sound came out. Grayson took a step closer, and I noticed something in his hand. A small black USB drive, identical to the one I'd found on my porch. He held it up between two fingers, his lips curling into a faint smile. It spreads, you know, he continued, from one person to the next, like a virus. All it takes is one look, one click, and it finds you. You can't run from it. You can't fight it. You let it in, and now it's part of you. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaking so badly I thought they might give out. The figures around me didn't move, didn't speak. They just stood there, staring, with those hollow, empty eyes. I tightened my grip on the knife, but it felt useless, like a child's toy against whatever this was. "Please," I managed to choke out. "What do you want from me?" Grayson's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. He held out the USB drive, as if offering it to me. "It's not about what we want," he said. "It's about what it wants, and all it wants is to grow." Before I could react, the thing behind him surged forward, its twisted form enveloping me like a wave of darkness. The world spun, and for a moment I felt weightless, like I was falling into an endless void. I could hear the distorted voice, louder than ever, repeating the same words over and over. "You can't hide forever." And then, silence. When I woke up, I was back in my living room. The house was quiet, the lights on, and everything looked normal. Too normal. My laptop was still on the table, the USB drive plugged in, but the screen was blank. I reached for it with trembling hands and ejected the drive. Nothing happened. No flicker, no noise. Just nothing. I thought about calling someone, the police, a friend, anyone. But what would I even say? That my neighbor, who'd been arrested for murder 5 years ago, was now some kind of messenger for a glitching nightmare entity? That I'd been hunted through the woods by something that didn't belong in this world? I sat there for hours, staring at the USB drive in my hand, trying to make sense of it all. But deep down, I knew there was no making sense of it. Later that night, I heard a knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate taps. I didn't answer. I couldn't. But when I finally worked up the courage to look through the peephole, no one was there. Just a small black USB drive, sitting on the welcome mat. I left it there. But as I write this, I know it doesn't matter. It's already here. And if you're reading this, it's probably already found you too. My brother works security for Area 51, the dark web claims. His disappearance is linked to a top-secret experiment that went wrong. All right, let me preface this by saying I'm not a conspiracy nut. I'm not one of those people who spends hours on forums arguing about lizard people or whatever. I'm just a regular guy. I have a job, rent to pay, and up until a few weeks ago, I'd say my life was pretty normal. Then Ethan went missing. Ethan's my older brother. He's always been the responsible one. If you had asked me a month ago to describe him, I'd have said something like, the guy who does everything by the book. He was one of those people who double-check to make sure his alarm clock was set, even though he never overslept. That's why this whole situation doesn't make sense. Let me back up. Ethan worked as a security contractor at Area 51. Yeah, that Area 51. He didn't brag about it or act like he had some big, important job. He'd just say it was mostly boring. Guarding fences, escorting researchers, checking IDs, that kind of stuff. He'd joke about it sometimes, saying, "People think I'm protecting aliens. Really, I'm just keeping nosy college kids from sneaking in with GoPros." He wasn't allowed to talk much about what he did, and he took that seriously. But every once in a while, after a few drinks, he'd let something slip. Nothing huge, just weird little comments. Like the time he mentioned that some parts of the base didn't show up on any official maps, or how certain buildings were designed like labyrinths to confuse anyone who didn't have clearance. Stuff like that. At the time, I thought he was just hyping up his job to make it sound cooler. Now, I'm not so sure. The last time I saw Ethan was about a month ago. He came over for dinner at my apartment, like he did every couple of weeks. We had beers, watched a dumb action movie, and caught up. Nothing seemed off. He didn't act nervous or say anything weird, but as he was leaving, he paused at the door and said something that stuck with me. "Hey, if anything ever happens to me, don't believe what they tell you. Just promise me that." It was such a strange thing for him to say. I laughed it off, asking if he was planning on disappearing or something. He didn't laugh. He just looked at me, dead serious, and said, "I'm not planning anything, but if something does happen, check the tunnels." I remember the way he said it, like he was trying to tell me something without actually saying it. At the time, I thought maybe he was joking or being dramatic. I mean, who says stuff like that? But now it feels like a warning I didn't take seriously. The next morning, he texted me, "If anything happens to me, don't trust what they tell you. Check the tunnels. Password 31-85-shadow. That was the last message I ever got from him. When Ethan didn't show up to work the next day, his supervisor called our parents. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. Ethan wasn't the kind of guy to just skip out on work, especially not a job like his. My parents freaked out and started calling everyone they could think of. His friends, his co-workers, even some distant cousins. Nobody knew anything. I went straight to his apartment. It was locked, but I still had a spare key from when I helped him move in. Everything looked normal, like he'd just stepped out to run an errand. His coffee mug was still in the sink, and the book he'd been reading was open on the couch. The only thing missing was him. I called the police, but they weren't much help. "He's an adult," they said. "Adults are allowed to disappear if they want to." I told them about his job, about the message he sent me, but they didn't care. To them, he was just another missing person. That's when I started noticing the strange things. The first weird thing happened that night. I was going through Ethan's apartment, looking for anything that might explain where he went. I found his laptop under his bed, which was odd because he always kept it on his desk. The screen was cracked, like it had been dropped, and it wouldn't turn on. But here's the thing. Ethan was meticulous about his stuff. I've never seen him break anything, let alone his laptop. Then there was his phone. It was sitting on the kitchen counter, but when I tried to unlock it, the screen flashed for a second and then went black. It felt deliberate, like someone had tampered with it. That's when I remembered the text he sent me. Check the tunnels. What tunnels? Was he talking about something at Area 51, or was it some kind of code? I didn't know where to start, so I did the only thing I could think of. I Googled it. Big mistake. Most of what I found was garbage. Conspiracy theories about aliens, time travel, underground cities, you name it. But one thing kept coming up in all these forums, something called Shadow Protocol 31-85. Apparently, it's some top-secret project that's been rumored to exist for decades. The details were vague, but the stories were all the same. Experiments gone wrong, people disappearing, entire facilities being wiped off the map. At first, I thought it was just internet nonsense, but the more I read, the more unsettled I felt. Some of the posts were oddly specific, mentioning things like biological systems integration and neural interface failures, stuff that sounded way too advanced to be fake. Then I found a thread on a dark web forum. It was buried under pages of junk links, and I almost missed it. The title was just a string of numbers, 31-85. The post itself was short, but it sent a chill down my spine. If you're looking for answers about Shadow, 31-85, don't. People don't disappear from Area 51 by accident. If you've been contacted, you're already in danger. Stay away from the tunnels. How the hell did this random forum post connect to what Ethan said? And what did it mean by "you're already in danger"? At this point, I was equal parts terrified and curious. I didn't know what I was getting myself into, but I couldn't stop. I clicked on the thread, and it took me to a private chat room. To enter, I had to type in a password. I froze. There was no way this was real. But my hands were shaking as I typed the password Ethan gave me, 31-85-shadow. And just like that, the screen went black. When the screen went black, I thought for a second my laptop had crashed. My heart was pounding, but I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe I'd hit the wrong key, or maybe the site was just broken. But then a small blinking cursor appeared in the middle of the screen. It looked like something out of an old school computer terminal. Just a black screen with a single question. Who are you looking for? I stared at the question for a solid minute, unsure if I should even respond. But this was Ethan, my brother, the guy who took me fishing when we were kids, who helped me move 3 times without complaining, who never let me feel like I was alone. If this was some kind of lead, I had to follow it. I typed, "Ethan." The cursor blinked a few times, then a new question popped up. "How did you get the password?" I hesitated. Was this some kind of test? A trap? My hands were sweating so badly that I had to wipe them on my jeans before typing. He sent it to me before he disappeared. There was a long pause. I could feel my chest tightening with every passing second. Then, finally, the screen changed again. "If you want answers, prove it." Before I could even process what that meant, a file started downloading onto my laptop. It wasn't large, just a few megabytes, but the name made my stomach drop. Clearance Shadow _ a 51.mp4. I didn't want to open it. Everything in me was screaming to shut the laptop, wipe my hard drive, and forget I'd ever gone down this rabbit hole. But I couldn't. Not when I was this close. I clicked the file. The video was grainy, like it had been shot on a camera from the 90s. At first, it was hard to tell what I was looking at. Just a long, dimly lit hallway with a flickering fluorescent light. The camera operator was breathing heavily, and their footsteps echoed in the space. They walked for what felt like forever, passing rows of doors on either side. Each door had a number on it, but the numbers didn't make sense. They weren't sequential, more like random strings of digits and letters. Some doors were slightly ajar, revealing dark rooms beyond, but the operator never went inside. They just kept walking. Then they stopped. The camera panned to a door at the end of the hallway. This one was different. It was made of steel, with thick bolts and a keypad to the side. The label above it read, "Tunnel Access, 31-85. My heart skipped a beat. This couldn't be real. Could it? The person behind the camera hesitated, their breathing growing faster. They reached out to the keypad, punching in a series of numbers, too quickly for me to catch. With a loud clunk, the door unlocked. The camera operator pushed it open, revealing a staircase descending into complete darkness. They hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether to go down. Then, slowly, they started to descend. The stairs creaked under their weight, and the only light came from the camera's built-in flashlight. After about 20 steps, they reached the bottom. The camera panned around, revealing what looked like an underground lab. The walls were lined with glass tanks filled with some kind of murky liquid. Floating inside were things. I don't even know how to describe them. They looked almost human, but not quite. Their proportions were all wrong. Arms too long, eyes too large, skin pale and waxy. The camera operator whispered something, but it was too quiet to make out. They moved closer to one of the tanks, focusing on the thing inside. It twitched. That's when the alarm started. A deafening klaxon blared, and the camera operator spun around, the lights swinging wildly. Shadows darted across the walls, too fast to be human. The camera shook as the operator started running, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The video cut to static. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the black screen. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Were those experiments? Had Ethan been involved in something like that? Before I could even begin to process it, another message appeared on the screen. "You're in, over your head." I froze. Was someone watching me? I glanced around my room, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows. My apartment was silent, except for the hum of my laptop. I wanted to close the lid, to throw the damn thing out the window, but my curiosity got the better of me. I typed, "What happened to my brother?" There was no response, just the blinking cursor, mocking me. After a minute, the screen changed again. "If you want answers, go to the source. Coordinates incoming." A second later, a file popped up on my screen. It was a simple text document containing a string of numbers: 37.24804, negative 115.80015. I copied them into Google Maps. They pointed to a location in the middle of the Nevada desert, about 10 miles from the official perimeter of Area 51. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? My brain was running in circles, trying to decide what to do. If I went to the coordinates, I'd be trespassing on one of the most heavily guarded sites in the world. Best case, I'd get arrested. Worst case, well, I didn't want to think about that. But I couldn't just ignore it. Ethan had reached out to me for a reason. He trusted me to find him. And if there was even a chance he was still alive, I couldn't let that chance slip away. The next morning, I packed a bag with some basic supplies: water, snacks, a flashlight. I even bought a cheap burner phone in case something happened to my regular one. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. What would I even say? "Hey Mom, I'm heading to the desert to investigate a possible government conspiracy." By the time I got in my car, the sun was already rising. The drive was long and monotonous, the highway stretching endlessly in front of me. But as I got closer to the coordinates, the landscape started to change. The desert felt wrong. It's hard to explain, but there was this eerie stillness, like the whole area was holding its breath. I pulled off the highway and onto a dirt road, following the GPS. The closer I got to the coordinates, the worse I felt. My chest was tight, my palms slick with sweat. Every instinct was telling me to turn back, but I couldn't. Not yet. Finally, I reached the spot. There was nothing there, just a patch of flat desert with a few scraggly bushes. I stepped out of the car, squinting against the harsh sunlight. For a moment, I thought it was all a prank. some elaborate joke. Then I saw it. A metal hatch, half buried in the sand. My heart was pounding as I approached it. There was no lock, no markings, just a simple handle. I reached out, hesitating for a split second before pulling it open. The hatch creaked loudly, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel descending into the earth. It smelled like metal and something faintly rotten. I stood there, staring into the abyss, debating whether I had the courage to go down. Somewhere in the back of my mind, Ethan's last words echoed. Check the tunnels. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my flashlight and started to climb down. The first thing I noticed as I descended the ladder was the temperature. It was cold, unnaturally cold, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones and makes you feel like you'll never be warm again. The air smelled faintly metallic, with an undertone of something sour and decayed, like meat left out too long. The tunnel walls were made of smooth concrete, damp to the touch. My flashlight beam wavered as I reached the bottom and looked around. The hatch had led to a narrow corridor, barely wide enough for me to walk without brushing against the walls. The ceiling was low, and I had to duck slightly to keep from hitting my head on the exposed pipes that ran overhead. I stood there for a moment, trying to decide if I should keep going. A rational part of my brain was screaming at me to turn back, to climb up the ladder and drive away as fast as I could, but I couldn't. Ethan's face flashed in my mind, his easy grin, the way he used to ruffle my hair when we were kids. He was down here somewhere. I could feel it. I started walking. The tunnel stretched on for what felt like forever. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, the sound bouncing back at me from angles that didn't make sense. The deeper I went, the worse the air got. It was damp and heavy, like trying to breathe through a wet cloth. I pulled my hoodie up over my nose, but it didn't help much. After about 10 minutes, the tunnel branched off in two directions. Both paths were identical, with no markings to suggest where they led. I stood there, paralyzed with indecision. That's when I heard it. A faint click, click, click. It was coming from the left tunnel. The sound was rhythmic, mechanical, like metal tapping against stone. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. For a moment, I debated turning back, but the noise didn't feel random. It was too deliberate, too purposeful. Against my better judgment, I aimed my flashlight down the left tunnel and started walking. The sound grew louder with each step, echoing off the walls. I rounded a corner and saw something that made my stomach drop. A large metal door embedded in the wall, slightly ajar. The tapping sound was coming from behind it. I approached slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The door was old and rusted, with strange symbols etched into the metal. Circles, lines, and shapes that looked almost like a language, but didn't make any sense. The tapping stopped as I reached for the edge of the door. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the other side of the door, a voice whispered, "Help me!" I jumped back, nearly dropping my flashlight. The voice was faint, barely more than a breath, but it was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I didn't recognize it. It wasn't Ethan. I should have walked away. Any sane person would have walked away. But something about the way the voice said those two words, it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded desperate, like whoever or whatever was in there needed me. I gritted my teeth and pushed the door open. The room on the other side was massive, far bigger than I expected. It looked like some kind of abandoned lab. Rows of desks and computers lined the walls, their screens cracked and covered in dust. In the center of the room was a large glass cylinder, about 10 feet tall, filled with a thick, greenish liquid. Floating inside was a human-shaped figure. No, not human. Not entirely. It looked wrong, like something out of a nightmare. Its limbs were too long, its skin translucent, revealing black veins pulsing just beneath the surface. Its head was bald and featureless, except for a single slit where its mouth should have been. I couldn't tell if it was alive, but every few seconds, the liquid in the cylinder would ripple, as if it were breathing. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I stared at the thing in the cylinder, my brain struggling to process what I was looking at. Then the voice spoke again, louder this time. "Help me." It wasn't coming from the creature in the cylinder. It was coming from the far side of the room. I swung my flashlight toward the source of the sound. At first, I didn't see anything, just shadows dancing on the walls. Then I spotted it. A figure slumped against the wall, half hidden behind a desk. I stepped closer, my heart in my throat. It was a man, or what was left of him. His uniform was shredded, the fabric stained with dark, dried blood. His skin was pale and waxy, his chest barely rising and falling with shallow breaths. As I got closer, I noticed something even more disturbing. His eyes were completely black. No whites, no irises, just two dark voids staring up at me. He opened his mouth, and that same whispering voice came out. "Help me." I dropped to my knees, trying to keep my voice steady. "Who are you? What happened here?" He didn't answer. Instead, he lifted a trembling hand and pointed toward a small console near the cylinder. I followed his gaze, my flashlight illuminating the console. It was covered in buttons and switches, with a single monitor displaying a blinking red warning. Containment breached. Protocol shadow. 3185 initiated. My hand shook as I reached for the console. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. Turn it off? Activate something? Before I could make a decision, the man's voice rasped again. "They're coming." I whipped around, my flashlight scanning the room. The shadows seemed to shift and twist, like they were alive. For the first time, I noticed scratches on the walls, deep gouges in the concrete. Something had tried to claw its way out of here. The man's voice came again, more urgent this time. "You have to run." Then, from somewhere deeper in the tunnels, I heard it. A low, guttural growl. The sound was so deep, I felt it in my chest. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I'd ever heard before. My blood turned to ice as the growl was joined by a second, then a third. I didn't wait to see what was making the noise. I bolted for the door, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I ran. The growls grew louder, closer, echoing off the walls. Whatever was chasing me wasn't far behind. I sprinted back the way I came, the sounds of claws scraping against concrete filling the air. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were going to give out. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. When I reached the ladder, I didn't even pause to look back. I climbed as fast as I could, my hand slipping on the cold metal rungs. Just as I reached the top, I felt something graze my ankle, a sharp, burning pain that made me cry out. I slammed the hatch shut and collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. For a few seconds, I thought I was safe. Then I heard it. A faint click, 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 coming from directly beneath the hatch. The clicking didn't stop. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like something was testing the hatch. I sat there frozen, my back against the metal, clutching the flashlight in one hand and my phone in the other. My ankle throbbed, a sharp, searing pain where whatever was down there had grabbed me. I didn't dare look. I didn't want to see how bad it was. The clicking turned into scraping. Whatever was beneath me wasn't giving up. It didn't sound like claws this time. It was slower, almost methodical, like it was trying to figure out the latch. I forced myself to stand, every nerve in my body screaming in protest. The desert around me was eerily silent, the kind of silence that presses down on you like a weight. No wind, no crickets, no sound at all. Just the scraping. I limped back to my car, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The hatch stayed closed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. When I reached my car, I threw myself inside and locked the doors, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. I sat there for a long moment, staring out at the empty desert. The hatch was just a dark square in the sand, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. I half expected it to fly open, for whatever was down there to come crawling out. It didn't. The scraping stopped. The silence returned. That was almost worse. It wasn't until I started driving that I noticed the blood. My ankle was slick with it, soaking through my sock and staining the floor mat. I pulled over after a few miles, parking on the side of the desolate road, and finally worked up the courage to look. There were 3 deep gashes running across my ankle, perfectly parallel, like they'd been made with a scalpel. The skin around the cuts was dark and mottled, an angry red that spread out in jagged lines. It didn't look natural. It didn't feel natural either. My whole leg was numb, except for a strange, throbbing heat radiating from the wound. I wrapped it as best I could with a shirt from my bag and got back on the road. I didn't know where I was going, just away. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights chasing me, or worse, something on foot. But the desert behind me stayed empty. For a while. I'd been driving for about 20 minutes when my phone buzzed. I nearly jumped out of my skin. My hands were so sweaty that I almost dropped it. I fumbled to unlock the screen, half hoping it was some mundane notification that would break the tension. It wasn't. It was a text message. No number, just a blank sender field. The mark has been made. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my ears. The mark? What the hell did that mean? My first instinct was to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal. Just a single bar of service that blinked in and out, like the phone couldn't decide if it wanted to connect. The car suddenly felt too small, too exposed. I pulled over again, parking under the shadow of a rock formation. The sky was pitch black now, the stars overhead bright but cold. I locked the doors and turned off the engine, sitting in the dark with my flashlight clutched tightly in my lap. The mark has been made. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. The tunnels, the cylinder, the man with the black eyes, and now this. Was the mark the wound on my ankle? Was that what they meant? I pulled back the makeshift bandage to take another look, but what I saw made my stomach turn. The gashes weren't just cuts anymore. The dark, mottled skin around them had started to spread, forming a strange pattern that almost looked like writing. The lines curved and twisted in intricate shapes, like some kind of alien script. I could feel it too, a faint, pulsating sensation, as if something was moving just beneath the surface. I tried not to scream. My breathing came in short, panicked gasps as I pressed the bandage back into place. The pain was getting worse, radiating up my leg in sharp, stabbing bursts. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to call. All I knew was that I couldn't stay here. I turned the key in the ignition. Nothing. The engine wouldn't start. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at the dashboard, willing the car to start. The key turned, the engine sputtered, but it wouldn't catch. I was stuck, miles from anywhere, with no signal and no way to call for help. That's when I saw the lights. At first, I thought they were headlights, maybe a passing car, or someone coming to help. But they weren't on the road. They were in the desert, far off to my left, moving in strange, erratic patterns. There were 3 of them, small and bright, like glowing orbs. They hovered in the air, weaving back and forth, growing brighter with each passing second. I turned off the flashlight, sinking lower in my seat. The orbs weren't headlights. They weren't drones either. They moved too fluidly, too deliberately, like they were alive. They zigzagged across the desert, then stopped suddenly, hovering in place. And then they started moving toward me. I don't remember much of what happened next. Everything's a blur of panic and adrenaline. I remember fumbling for the flashlight, throwing open the car door, and limping as fast as I could toward the rock formation. The orbs were close now, close enough that I could hear them. They made a low, humming sound, like static mixed with whispers. I crouched behind a boulder, pressing myself against the cold stone, trying to stay out of sight. The humming grew louder, the whispers more distinct. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it felt like they were speaking directly to me, their words crawling into my brain and setting my nerves on fire. The lights stopped just a few feet from the car. For a moment, I thought they were going to leave, but then they began to search. One orb floated toward the car, circling it slowly, scanning the windows like it was looking for something. The second one drifted toward the rock formation, its glow casting long, eerie shadows. The third stayed in place, pulsing faintly, as if it were watching over the other 2. I held my breath, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. The orb near the rocks was getting closer, its light reflecting off the stone, creeping toward me inch by inch. I clenched my fists, pressing them against my mouth to keep from making a sound, and then the whispers stopped. The light dimmed, fading into darkness. For a split second, I thought they'd given up, that maybe they hadn't seen me, but then I felt it, a cold, sharp pressure on my shoulder. I turned, and the last thing I saw before everything went black was the orb, hovering inches from my face, its glow filling my vision until there was nothing left. I woke up to darkness, not the kind of darkness you get in your bedroom at night, where your eyes adjust and you can make out vague shapes. This was absolute, suffocating black. I couldn't see my hands in front of my face, couldn't tell if my eyes were even open. The air was heavy and damp, carrying that same metallic tang I'd smelled in the tunnels. When I tried to move, I couldn't. My wrists and ankles were bound, strapped down to a cold metal surface. The pain in my leg was unbearable now, radiating up into my hip and lower back. Whatever those things had done to me, it was spreading. I panicked, thrashing against the restraints, but it was no use. The more I struggled, the more I noticed something else. The sound. Faint, almost imperceptible at first, but it was there. A low, rhythmic hum, punctuated by sharp, mechanical clicks. The same clicking I'd heard in the tunnels. Then, somewhere off to my right, I heard voices. They weren't speaking English, or if they were, it was so distorted that I couldn't understand it. The voices were low and guttural, almost vibrating, like the sound was coming from deep within their chests. I strained to hear, hoping for any clue about where I was or who had taken me, but the words slipped past my comprehension like water through my fingers. A light flickered on above me, harsh and blinding. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart racing as the voices grew louder, closer. When I finally dared to open my eyes, I wished I hadn't. The room was massive, bigger than any lab I'd ever seen in a movie. The walls were lined with more of those glass cylinders, filled with the same greenish liquid. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, stretching out into the distance. And inside each one was a figure. Some looked human, or close to it. Others didn't. They were twisted, deformed, arms bending at impossible angles, spines arched like they'd been snapped in half. Their faces were blank and smooth, as if someone had stretched skin over a mannequin's head. Black veins pulsed beneath their skin, spreading out in fractal patterns that reminded me of the marks on my ankle. One of the cylinders nearby cracked open with a hiss, and a figure slumped out onto the floor. It didn't move, but its chest rose and fell in shallow, unnatural breaths. I could see its skin twitching, like something was crawling just beneath the surface. I was so focused on the cylinders that I didn't notice the figures standing over me until one of them moved. The figures were tall, easily 7 feet, dressed in sleek black uniforms that shimmered faintly in the light. Their faces were obscured by masks, featureless except for a single horizontal slit where their eyes should have been. But it wasn't the masks that terrified me. It was their movements. They didn't walk so much as glide, their limbs moving with a smooth, mechanical precision that made my stomach turn. One of them leaned over me, tilting its head like it was studying an insect. Its mask was inches from my face, and for a moment, I swore I could see something moving behind the slit, something wet and glistening. It spoke, its voice a low rumble that I felt in my chest. The words didn't make sense, but the intent behind them was clear. This wasn't a rescue. This wasn't even an interrogation. This was an experiment. I don't know how long I was strapped to that table. Minutes? Hours? Days? Time didn't mean anything down there. The figures moved around me, adjusting machines, injecting things into my arm, pressing cold, metallic instruments against my skin. Every time they touched my leg, the pain flared to unbearable levels, and I could feel the marks spreading further. I could barely lift my head, but when I did, I saw them. The marks weren't just spreading, they were changing. They weren't random lines anymore. They were symbols, intricate and precise, glowing faintly beneath my skin. I couldn't read them, but I could feel them, like they were burrowing into me, rewriting me from the inside out. At one point, they wheeled a mirror in front of me. I don't know if they were showing me on purpose, or if it was just part of their process, but when I saw my reflection, I screamed. My eyes, they weren't mine anymore. The whites were gone, replaced by an oily black that seemed to ripple in the light. The veins around them were dark and jagged, branching out across my face, like cracks in a porcelain doll. I looked like one of the things in the cylinders. I tried to speak, to beg, to scream, but my voice was gone. My throat burned, and when I opened my mouth, the only sound that came out was a low, guttural growl. Eventually, they stopped. The figures stepped back, their masks tilting slightly as they examined me one last time. One of them tapped something on a nearby console, and the restraints holding me down released with a sharp click. I tried to move, but my limbs didn't respond the way they should have. My arms felt too long, my legs too heavy. It was like my body wasn't my own anymore. They didn't speak to me, They didn't explain. They just turned and glided out of the room, leaving me there, alone and broken. For a long time, I just lay there, staring up at the light. My mind was blank, my body numb. Eventually, I managed to sit up, swinging my legs over the side of the table. My feet hit the floor, and I noticed something I hadn't before. The humming. It wasn't coming from the machines or the walls. It was coming from me. I don't remember how I got out. I don't remember walking through the tunnels or climbing out of the hatch. The next thing I knew, I was standing in the desert, the morning sun burning my skin. My car was gone. The hatch was gone. The coordinates on my phone were gone, but the marks on my leg weren't. I don't know how much time has passed since then. Days? Weeks? It doesn't matter. My body is changing faster now. The marks have spread across my chest, my arms, my neck, my eyes. What's left of them can see things they shouldn't, things that aren't there. The whispers never stop. I tried to go to the hospital, but they wouldn't let me in. They said my ID didn't match their records, that there was no one named me in their system. They looked at me like I wasn't human. Maybe I'm not. The last time I looked in the mirror, I saw someone else staring back. Their face was smooth and featureless, their black eyes endless and hollow. I don't know how much longer I have before I lose myself completely, but I can still hear Ethan. In the back of my mind, through the whispers and the static, I can hear his voice. Check the tunnels. I think I know what he meant now. The tunnels weren't just a place. They were a threshold, a door to something beyond us, something we were never meant to find. Whatever they were doing at Area 51, whatever Shadow 31-85 was, it wasn't just an experiment. It was an invitation